Are 2022 F1 cars going to be really hard to drive? So Lando Norris said in an interview that the 2022 F1 cars are not as nice to drive after trying it in the McLaren simulator. And yes, that was a pretty fleeting comment that led some to think that these new cars are going to be really tricky. To some, that is a great thing, moving back to the cars that look more lively with drivers battling them through the corners. But we're not so sure on whether things are actually going to pan out that way. So today I'm going to give you my thoughts on these cars from the perspective of a driver, and we've got Scarbs to explain this from the perspective of an engineer, all to figure out if they will actually be harder to drive. Let's go. Before we get into it, what did Lando actually say? It's a very different car to drive. In a way, not as nice as this season. But I think hopefully that's the same case with every other team as well. And we'll see. There's no point in trying to think it's amazing or terrible. Now, it's going to be very different. There are so many changes that it would be strange if it drove the same. But the not as nice bit, well, that does seem a little bit strange. So let's explain. But the one thing we have to talk about here is that Lando talks about the sim as if he's driven this year's McLaren. And to be honest, that's pretty cool that these drivers are treating the sim and the car as the same thing, and that the model the teams have is that accurate. Now, the main thing that is worth considering is that the cars are very, very early in their development, with none of them even completing a single lap of testing.
Everything's at a really early stage of the development, and that means that not everything is gelling perfectly together. The teams are much better at these nowadays than they would have been in the past, but still, it will be unrefined. So, as I say, aspects of the car will jar with other aspects. So it will be, suspension and aero or tyres and brakes. And the teams just have to kind of work through this, find out the problems, find out the ones that they can solve relatively easily with setup or with minor design changes.
It could also be that the design philosophy that McLaren have chosen is creating a car that is a bit tougher to drive.
Now this year, the cars are going to run very flat to the ground. We're not going to have even low rake or high rake. They're going to be just very low, very flat to get the most out of the underfloor. Now, to do that, that means you've really got to control the suspension movement. And you don't want to do that too much because that will lose you some mechanical grip. So you have to start to decide the trade-off between how sensitive the aero is to the ride height against how much mechanical grip you've got. So they'll run lots of different models in the simulator. Now, there's two types of simulation we talk about here. At the early stages, there's no driver sat there in a kind of a plastic tub driving. This is just putting the tyre data, the engine, the aero, the mechanical data, everything goes into the computer, and they just run lots of loops around what works, how sensitive can we afford to make the car, and how much we're going to lose on different tracks. It's then later that the driver comes into the driver in the loop simulators, which everyone kind of thinks is the simulator.
The teams have insanely complex modelling systems that essentially do all of the physics calculations you would as an engineer. So modelling the movement of the components, then how that affects the grip, as well as how the air is behaving over the car. But the computer can simulate how all of these things affect each other. So how the aero creates grip, which then affects the tyre and the suspension, and so on. It goes on and on. Now, all of these calculations give a great idea of how the car will perform. But what all that wizardry doesn't tell you is if the car is actually drivable on the limit. Often you can set up a car so it's absolutely rapid, but also lethal. And it's no good if you're the fastest car over a lap, but in the barrier on lap 5.
From an engineer's point of view, create a very fast car in the simulator. When it comes to the driver in the loop simulator, the driver may say, well, that's fine, but I'm finding it a bit edgy in a certain situation. Can we go back and, refine that model and say, maybe we'll make the aero a bit less sensitive, give it a bit more movement so that you get better grip in the slower corners and you're not feeling quite so edgy in the fast corners. So that kind of goes round and round and round. And that's the work of the race engineers, the drivers and the design team, as I say, throughout the life of the car.
So the teams work on making the car more refined on the limit, make things more consistent over different ride heights, G-loads or downforce levels to make the cars more friendly to drive. And if you look at that Merc from last year, the drivers could chuck it into the corners and it dealt with it incredibly well, not to mention how good it was over the curbs. But these cars are so different, so the teams will still be learning.
So from the driver's point of view, it's all going to be about how can you get this car to work in a way that they can get it to the limit and run those super fast laps in qualifying, and obviously those important laps through the race. And everything has changed. All the drivers, they're so used to all of the ways that the old cars worked and the procedures that the teams went through. Lots of that have changed. Probably most of all is the aero. So we have what we call the ground effects, these big underfloor tunnels, which create so much more of the downforce, much less with the wings. And this will be different as well. You know, the car will work different around the lap. You'll be much faster on the straights. They've got a lot less drag, so they'll be arriving at the corners at different speed. And as they go through corners, they're going to be different. They'll feel different. And one of the questions that's been raised a lot is what happens when you hit a curb and this, you know, really important underfloor gets tipped sideways? Will that upset the aerodynamics? Will the driver suddenly lose all downforce? So that's what used to happen in the old days of the 70s and 80s. That's not quite going to happen this time. We don't have the skirts at the side, so the floor is still as high as it was last year. It contributes more to downforce, but the way the teams will design the floor is to make sure that it's not too on and off with its downforce, and they will try and make it quite benign, so that if you do tip sideways, if you do hit a curb, you're not going to suddenly lose your downforce. And different teams will have different ways of dealing with that, and drivers will have different reactions to it as well. So we'll have to see. There's every chance that the team could think they've got a great underfloor, but in practice on a track, when you do hit a curb or you go over some bumps or something else happens, that it suddenly, you know, becomes, you know, quite unsteady, and the driver loses grip, loses confidence, or loses balance.
I've been lucky enough to drive some cars that are really tough to drive, like some of the earliest 90s F1 cars where they were really, really stiff. But over time, a number of races or the whole season, as a driver, you can play and develop the setup. So this will be making little tweaks to the geometry, the suspension, or even to tyre pressures to make the car suit you more as a driver. And it just takes a bit of time. But the main reason I was surprised by Lando's comment was that the changes in the new car all look like they would make the car nicer to drive, not more difficult.
Tyres are one of the biggest things that's changed, and they've changed in lots of ways. They're a completely different set of tyres now. So they are 18-inch profiles. We describe them as low-profile tyres, but actually the sidewall is still quite large because the tyres are bigger in diameter, and that itself brings problems. But the first thing the drivers will feel with a slightly lower profile and the stronger sidewalls that the car will have is as you turn in, the tyres will almost immediately relax. You don't get that slip that you get with these big balloon tyres. So that sort of transience between turn in and actual tyres giving you grip is much quicker. Most drivers should like that. And then other aspects of the tyres are quite different. They're larger diameter, so in theory they should warm up much slower because you've got more tyre to warm up. That has been something probably have worked on. They've really improved the warm-up of these tyres. Remember that tyre warmers will be banned over the coming years. They're going to turn the temperature down until effectively they're not on at all. So that's another thing that the drivers will have to kind of get used to. Equally, the biggest problem you've had with the tyres recently is that the tyres, as soon as you slide the car, the tyres overheat massively, and that creates lots of problems, particularly with the rear tyres. So Pirelli have again worked on these tyres, and they think that they've solved this problem of the tyres overheating too much with sliding. So as much as these tyres may feel a bit different for the drivers, certainly in the race, they should be a much better race tyre because they're not so sensitive to when you're sort of sliding behind other cars, even if you do lose some downforce.
All of that sounds like a car that would be a dream to race. Tyres that warm up quicker, and when you do push it a little bit too far, they don't overheat. So the drivers can really push without the threat of 3 slow laps due to cooked tyres after having just a little bit of a slide.
This is about the springs of the dampers inside the cars. Now, there's lots has been banned in this area. And the simplest way to describe it is if you look at an onboard from 2021, the car looks perfectly level. It's like it's got Rolls-Royce suspension, doesn't it? There's no shaking on the camera. If you look back to an old Senna onboard, it looks like the camera was barely held onto the car at all. It's wobbling, it's shaking around. That's the difference between the old suspension and what we had in 2021. Now, we're not quite reversing that change, but there is a lot less for the teams to be able to control the car with the suspension now. And this is going to be a big issue, especially because we're going to be running very low ride heights. And that makes it very hard for the suspension to control the car and to keep the floor nice and level to get it working to its maximum. So teams have got a huge amount of work to do to get this suspension working perfectly for this car. And that's even before we start to think of all the clever things that we'd like to do, like we saw last year with the back of the car dropping and, you know, stuff like that on the straights. Big job for the teams, a lot for the drivers to cope with, but equally a lot for the drivers to put good feedback into the development process to make this car easier to drive on the edge.
Now, a more lively car can be harder to drive, but it can also be more fun. The cars I drove were much more lively, but they had a nice window of grip. So if you do step over the limit of grip, you're not going straight in the barrier. You can collect the car and race on. It's where the car still has grip when it's over the limit, rather than being really peaky, where if you do go over the limit, that's it. Kind of like last year's Haas.
Forget about qualifying for a moment. If you look at the race, which is really where the car's balance and ability to drive well is really important, lots has been done, as we've said, to try and improve that. So if you're a car behind another one, first of all, your aerodynamics should work much better. You won't be losing as much downforce when you're behind the car in corners, but you'll kind of keep that balance of the car. You won't get the understeer that drivers complain so much about over these, sort of past 10 or so years. If you do slide while you're behind another car, the aero should be much more benign. So when the car is yawing, when it's kind of going sideways through the air, the downforce should still be produced. The tires won't start overheating. And then when you want to kind of make that killer move and hop over the curb to get a run onto the next straight, the suspension and the aero should cope with it fairly well as these cars, particularly as they start to develop and do much better. So they may be trickier and they're definitely going to be different to drive. But I think overall, we're going to end up with a much more raceable car in race conditions because of all of these little changes.
So I think give McLaren the testing and maybe a couple of races, and that car will be much nicer to drive. But we'll soon see in winter testing. You should check out this whole playlist of me and Craig breaking down these new 2022 F1 cars. And look how close we are to 800,000 subscribers. If you've watched a few videos and aren't subbed yet, please help us out. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.